Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of our Subcareer Investor Series. We're going to talk to all the investors of Subcareer and find out a bit more about who they are and why they got involved and partnered with Subcareer. My name's James Bailey. It's a pleasure to talk to you again. And today we're talking to Rennick Paley. Rennick is the CEO of Stratos, one of our lead investors from Series A round. Good to have you on board, Rennick.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
really happy to be involved.
Yeah, thank you. So Rennick, tell me, what's your background? How did you get involved with crypto? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, so the first time I really got interested in crypto was in 2015 when I was doing some research on banks and financial technology in emerging markets. And I stumbled upon Ethereum and looked at the technology or what it was intending to be and thought, if this becomes what it seems like it can be, that this is going to change the world and be really impactful. So from that point, I left where I was working at the time, which was an investment firm, and started Stratos to start investing in the space.
It's always interesting, right? There's a lot of people in this industry that have come from the investment firm. Do you still have a lot of peers back there in that world that you're trying to bring over into the new world these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's easier to convince people these days. And I don't know if that's because they're just sort of seeing the price action and saying, okay, there's clearly something to this, or if more and more people who are kind of traditional finance people are doing their homework and starting to understand what this is all about. But yeah, still, I would say most people are not all in on the space yet by any means, but more people are starting to recognize its merits, and it's not as much of like
A fringe world out there for
yeah, as it was maybe in 2017 or 2018.
I've noticed that a lot as well. When we're hiring a lot at the moment, and the conversations these days, there's a lot more interest in blockchain as more of a foundation for the future of the internet, rather than just a speculative currency kind of platform, a place to make a quick buck, which is great because it obviously provides that validity to what we're doing. So tell us, Rennick, so how did you learn about Subcareer? How did you find us?
So I'm an advisor at the Berkeley Blockchain Accelerator. And so we got introduced to Sam through that. And from there, built the relationship and got to know Subquery and OnFinality. So, that's where it came from. But, I think actually to your last point, it really feels like over the last year, people have come to understand that blockchain is a lot more than speculative cryptocurrencies. And I think Subquery is actually a perfect example of the opposite of that. Subquery is this thing that is a very key piece of infrastructure. No one would really look at that and say this is a speculative investment at all. It's actually something that's very concrete in the way that you can identify its value in its ecosystem, and it has an economic system built into it that is designed to be functional and sustainable, not just something that only works when there's a bull market. So I think it's a perfect example of how things are moving in that direction.
Yeah, it is quite important to us, right? In a way, Subquery is a foundational piece of that technology stack to which you would build all these applications in the future, whether they're in DeFi or NFTs or what's next, what's next. But we've done a lot of work in that foundation area, and in a way we're kind of ahead of the curve, but we're expecting a huge amount of growth, especially in Polkadot, but also in a lot of other what we call Generation 3 blockchains, Generation 3 layer 1 chains that are kind of coming up and building their own communities around those. Are you quite involved in the Polkadot community or in that aspect of blockchain?
Yeah, so we are also part of the Polkadot Venture Network, and so are pretty involved in the community, looking at sort of the next wave of projects that are coming up and being built on the infrastructure of Polkadot that has been developed. And I think, Polkadot in general is a really, really interesting ecosystem because it really is forward looking in terms of what the multi-chain world is going to look like in the future. And I think, it was designed from the ground up to be something that enabled various teams to create many different chains and have their own versions of certain, consensus mechanisms within parameters and programming languages. And so I think, Subquery is in a way linking that all together, and enabling people to understand what's going on in the space that I think is going to really see pretty significant growth over the next year or two. A lot of the building blocks have been laid, so to speak. The relay chain is there. The early crowd loans have started to happen and, clearly have been really successful. So we're on the cusp of a lot of this sort of development that maybe people who are part of the ecosystem have been anticipating for a while, but that's because all the pieces have had to come into place. And now I think this is where Subquery is really going to start to shine.
Those crowd loans are super exciting right now. With the first one on Polkadot, completing, and obviously, Kusama has been going for some time, and I think 12 or 13 crowd loans by now. It's really kind of, it seems like everyone in Kusama has seen that this crazy idea for crowd loans has worked, and it's worked very successfully. And we've seen huge amounts of money locked up for a year on these crowd loans. So we're just seeing this Polkadot and Kusama ecosystem really start to take off and get that interest from the bigger retail community. At least it's what
there's a lot of interesting things to learn by observing what's going on with the crowd loans. I think on the one hand, people, a cynic about the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystems might have said, well, basically you just have to rent space in perpetuity on the relay chain. But what I think the crowd loans have shown is actually they're a great mechanism for involving the broader community and distributing the governance token of a particular project pretty widely. And so in that sense, they've been really successful. And I think if you just look at token prices of projects pre and post crowd loan, it seems that the crowd loan actually has increased the market cap of those projects so significantly that it's effectively financed the rental cost of the relay chain slot. So net, it's a positive for all the parties involved. And then to think, well, where did all of this money come from that's being locked up in these crowd loans? Well, it came from the rise in value of the Polkadot and Kusama ecosystems to begin with. It's almost created by that success, in and of itself. And so in that sense, it's creating a place for that value creation to be utilized in a useful way, right? Otherwise, the DOT and KSM would just be floating around in the world, not really having anywhere to go. So it's actually, when you look at it holistically, it's a system that has functioned very well.
It's an excellent application of that. That's that tactic that I think everyone tries to use, which is locking down the supply of tokens into value bearing or yield bearing uses, I guess. And it's been interesting, right? Like at Subquery, we do a lot of, one of our most successful or one of our most popular Subquery projects is a project that provides crowd loan data to a wide variety of websites, actually. And it's been amazing watching the growth of this project, especially as the Polkadot crowd loan and auctions begin. It's just gone through the roof. And we've found all these websites out there using this data from Subquery. And one thing that I'm keen to sit down and do after the dust settles somewhat is to really dig deep into each of these crowd loans and these auctions and figure out, like what is the themes behind these? Which ones are kind of community driven versus whale driven? which ones have been built up by the power of everyone. It's like, Barack Obama, when he first got elected years ago, people talked about that being the first example of a huge amount of community donating on average $20 to this campaign. Which one of the Polkadot and Kusama slots have been granted in some way, and maybe that's a good indication for which projects have the strongest communities.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I look forward to reviewing that analysis with you when you're done with it. I suspect that it's going to look like a power law, and that's just the nature of how tokens have been distributed in a lot of these, in the DOT and KSM ecosystem. But I think what you're saying just like really highlights why we're so excited about Subquery and really the core component of our investment thesis, which is it's so highly levered to this. The success of Subquery is highly levered to the success of this entire ecosystem. Every single use case where data and analysis is required is going to play into Subquery's position. And so, we can talk about all these interesting things happening, and then if we look another layer deeper, we're going to realize that Subquery has been used to help drive that process in some way.
And that's one of our challenges is figuring out who's using us, because we find all these websites built off our data, and that's fine. That's a core kind of a tenet of our platform, is that it's open. Anyone can use it. Anyone can access this data. All we're doing is taking publicly available data and organizing it and giving some structure to it so that the average person can use it and take advantage of that data in a more intuitive way. So that's a really good point. Tell me about so Stratos. What's your investment thesis, I guess? How do you look at projects?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say, I think you're being very modest in saying, just taking public data and putting it in a place where the average person can use it. That's no small feat. Obviously the Google example is one that we used in our investment memo, but Google is doing essentially the same thing, and clearly it's a very important piece of infrastructure in Web 2. So Subquery will be the same for Web 3. And I think in this case, the dimensionality of the data is so much greater because you've got all this historical data, all this transaction data, in addition to just state. And so you could think of Google almost as just state history, if you want to try and draw that analog. So the potential for Subquery to be huge is definitely there. To answer your question about Stratos' overall investment thesis, so we kind of think of the world in a blueprint or like a roadmap, which we call it our Web3 blueprint, which is to say we have a vision about where the world will ultimately go, and that's one where everyone is using some sort of Web3 application without even necessarily knowing that it's Web3. It's integrated directly into their smartphone. They're using a decentralized finance, in their day-to-day financial activities. The next version of social media is going to be some sort of metaverse type concept. Their gaming, everything will have some sort of Web3 component, and people won't even really know that it's Web3 versus Web 2, except for that.
And that's really important, right? There's a lot of people that are already in the Web3 world already, but these are quite generally younger, but also people that are quite technologically astute. The challenge is building applications and environments where anyone can use it, that my parents can use it without even knowing that it's in Web3. That's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think it will take some time to get there. And I think it's the nature of frontier technologies that sort of like the more tech savvy people, the people working on it over the weekend and in their basement, so to speak, are the ones who are kind of driving it forward initially. And I think we're kind of there with Web3 right now. But in order to get to that future state, there are all these pieces of our blueprint that need to get built between now and then. And there's a couple of core verticals that we look at as being enablers of that end state. And so they don't necessarily happen in sequence. A lot of these things are happening in parallel. being developed together. So one of them is just broadly infrastructure. Another is identity. Another is, mobile wallets. Another is, bringing human judgment on chain. Another is just this metaverse idea, which I don't necessarily ascribe to the metaverse as being something that is, a replacement for real world spaces, although that's a subset of it. I think of metaverse as being this idea that, your internet life has more financial value than your day-to-day real world life. I think we're like NFTs are kind of this craze is kind of the first piece of that, but we see Subquery as being part of that infrastructure component, which is, it's kind of remarkable to think how much volume there is in Web3 and crypto today, considering what the transaction costs are in Ethereum. And that basically means, if it's a $200 gas cost, that means that the vast majority by count of everyday transactions are not viable on chain. But what happens when the transaction costs get cut by 10x or 100x, and the chains in the Polkadot ecosystem are enabling some of that? And so we're going to see this explosion of all of these other things that I'm talking about that suddenly become viable and accessible to the average person anywhere in the world. And as a result of that, you need to have the ability to understand the data and what's going on. You need something like Subquery. So it's part of that pillar of our blueprint.
Yeah, the microtransactions are going to be the next big thing here, and that's what Polkadot and other Generation 3 layer ones are going to enable.
Exactly.
And I like your point around. I completely agree. There are certain key parts that need to be put in place for this Web3 kind of migration. Identity, authentication, infrastructure, and under all of that really is data, is being able to access data in a fast, efficient, very optimal way. There's some stat out there I think people throw around, which I don't know how true it is, but they say that the amount of data that humanity generates doubles every 2 years. It's like Moore's law for data, and that's one big thing that we need to focus on, is building tools to harness the huge volume of data we're generating and put it to productive uses, which is, I guess, what we're trying to do at Subquery.
Yeah, exactly. Well, assuming that a lot of that future data creation is happening on chain, Subquery is in a pretty good spot to be a really important component of that.
So a last question I might have is what's your advice for any other entrepreneur or person wanting to set up a company and work in blockchain? What would be your advice to get started, or how to begin?
Well, I guess maybe two things. One is that forking another project that has already proven it works is interesting, but less interesting than really trying to like move the ball down the field. Like, SushiSwap versus Uniswap, that was a useful thing. I'm not saying, that they obviously were able to do something that was valuable for the Web3 community, just given the success of SushiSwap and the amount of liquidity that's in there. But, the harder things are what are creating the new, next step of technology. And so I encourage would-be founders to do that. The other thing I would say is really focus on community, because Web3 is all about community, and it doesn't require someone who is really great at like social media or something. I've seen it firsthand every day with Goldfinch, the way that we've built the community, and it's just by being consistent and giving good information to people, and talking about what the vision is and what's exciting to you, because there will be a subset of people in the world who find that also really interesting, and you'll attract them if you're just consistent about it. And I think that's one of the things that's really critical to success for these projects.
I can agree more. I've continuously blown away by the interest by our community. And when we hire new people, for example, at Subquery, they're always amazed by how big the community is, how fast it's growing, and how many people are in there every day, kind of engaging with it. But you're right; it's just bring everyone along on the mission. And that's one thing when you work in this every day, you kind of don't talk about it enough. You don't talk about that vision. You kind of assume people know it, but it's important just to keep saying it so that no one ever forgets it, or everyone can completely understand it. There's a rule, I think someone's told me, right? It's you got to be able to keep saying something so well that if someone calls you at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning and you're like 6 vodka Red Bulls deep, you can still say it exactly the same way. And I think that's quite relevant to this.
There you go. Well, I'm glad you're getting your practice in. Maybe I'll be the one calling you. But I've got to hand it to you and the rest of the Subcareer team. You guys are doing a really good job of getting the word out and building the community and keeping people excited about what you're building. So you're a great example.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rennick, and thank you very much for your support from Stratos. There's investors that are very kind of arm's length, and then there are investors that take a real deep view of what we're doing and try to understand at another level of how we're trying to grow the community and grow our products, and you're definitely one of the latter. So we've been very we find it very valuable, the feedback that we get from you. So thank you very much for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to have you on board.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind words.